All right. Hey, good morning, everyone. It's a blessing to see you guys all. I know we canceled last week, last minute, but it's okay. This is our second to last class. We will talk about biblical law today, and then we will next week talk about epistles or letters. So we've covered, these are what would fall under the prose discourse, right? At the beginning of the course, we said there's three major categories: narrative, which is the stories; poetry, which we talked about, is things like prophecy, songs, apocalypse, that sort of thing. And then there's prose discourse, which is all of the other writing that isn't a story and isn't poetry. And in the Bible, that is things like the census data, so large portions of Chronicles, Numbers, parts of Second Samuel, maybe. You also have, you have census data, you have the biblical law, which we're going to talk about. You have the epistles and genealogies, but those are spread more as a part of the story. So you do have sections that are genealogical, but those often form a role within the narrative, as opposed to like the law, which is kind of just large sections of the text that are just law code. But before we get there, when we met last, like 3 weeks ago, our reading exercise was looking at Revelation 21, the new heavens and the new earth. Did anyone have any? And we're going to look at things like patterns and numbers and symbolism and things like that, that we said are very common in apocalyptic writing. Did anyone have any thoughts from that reading, or any comments, or did they get anything out of that? And it's okay if not, we can move on to this week's discussion.
Well, I saw in the Numbers, 12 gates, 12 angels, and then from the rest of the Bible, there was 12 apostles,
Yep.
12 tribes.
And in fact, so that's one of the biggest things when you see about Revelation, is about the New Jerusalem, right? It talks about there's 12 gates, there's names and 12 doors, there's 12 apostles, 12 tribes, and really what's that showing is the unification of God's people, right? God's people is no longer just Israel or just the church, but it is the new heavens and the new earth comprises all of God's people, whoever those may be, which are represented by the 12 apostles and by the 12 the 12 disciples, the 12 tribes. Any other thoughts?
I just
Yeah.
noticed this, but the 144,000 that were saved, and if you multiply 12 times 12, it's 144, correct?
Correct.
Now, does that represent, what would that represent?
So
all are being saved?
That's a great question. The how we understand the 144,000 in Revelation is complex. There are some people that hold that is a very literal number. Some people, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, feel that is the total number of people who are saved. There's only 144,000 people that get saved, and and I don't know Jehovah's Witness theology super well, so I don't want to misrepresent it, but a core to their idea is that God's people is 144,000 people total in all of history, and your goal is to be one of those 144,000. So others interpret that as a number of Jewish people who are saved during the time of tribulation, and so that in that time, this is the total number of people who are saved. The others look at that number, and so, for instance, in when Jerusalem was besieged by Titus, Caesar, during the Jewish Wars around 69 to 70 AD. It's when the Jerusalem was destroyed. Just prior to that siege, there are records that indicate that the Christians in Jerusalem received prophetic dreams to flee the city, and they went and they hid in Petra. And roughly 144,000 Christians survived the sack of Jerusalem in 70 AD when the temple fell, because they had escaped and fled. And so there are some that say, well, to the people who are reading Revelation, when they think of 144,000 people that have been set aside and have hidden and have fled in the mountains, that it would be those Christians who fled the city of Jerusalem prior to the sack under, I think it's Titus or Tatian, one of the two. He ended up becoming emperor after that, but it was in the Jewish war in 69 to 70 AD. It's when the temple was destroyed ultimately. Others see it much more symbolically. They see that, well, 12 times 1,000. Well, 12 represents the apostles, 12 represents the tribes, and 1,000 often represents an infinite, indescribable number. Sometimes 1,000 is a literal number in the Bible. Sometimes it's symbolic. For instance, when it says God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, that's not a limiting statement. It doesn't mean, well, if I find 1,001 hills, God doesn't own those cattle on that one hill, right? It meant to say that God owns all of it, an indescribable infinite amount. Or when it says God's faithfulness continues to 1,000 generations, that is not a statement limiting God's faithfulness. Because if we read that very literally, then once we get to generation 1,001, God's faithfulness is allowed to stop. But that's not what that passage is indicating. It's talking about God's ongoing, unending, enduring faithfulness. So sometimes 1,000 is not literal in but the Bible. And so the one of the thoughts is that that represents the totality of those who are saved. And especially when you read Revelation, and this is kind of outside of this specific passage, but it's a good topic when we talk about apocalypse. Oftentimes, when you read Revelation, John hears something first, and then he sees something that is the same as what he just heard about. And the best example, and those two images are meant to define each other, kind of like parallelism, like we talked about. And the best example is that when John is weeping because there are none worthy to open the scroll, he hears the angel say, "Behold," I would say, but I think it's "Behold," like the Lion of Judah, and he describes it's in Revelation 5 or 6, 5, and he says, "Behold," like the Lion of Judah, right? And he describes Jesus. Actually, I'll just pull it up so that I give the exact language because it matters in this context. And it's in Revelation 5. And so one of the elders says, so John hears first, right? "Weep no more. Behold, the Lion of Judah of the tribe, the Root of David has conquered, so he can open the scroll." So that's what he hears. And then he turns and sees a lamb standing as though he had been slain. So what that tells us is what John hears about is a Lion of Judah, a conquering king. But what he sees is a slaughtered lamb. And so those two images then redefine each other. So how we understand and define conquering Lion of Judah is dictated by what John sees, the slain lamb. And so with that similar model, he hears the proclamation about the 144,000, and then he turns and sees the multitude. And so if we accept that sometimes what John hears is then redefined by what he sees, that 144,000 gets redefined by the multitudes from every tribe, nation, and tongue that he sees immediately following. So that's another interpretation, that number is not literal at all. It is very symbolic because of 12 times 1,000, but it is then redefined as the multitudes who are praising God from every tribe, nation, and tongue. So there's a ton of different ways of reading that, and all of them carry baggage. If we say, well, no, it has to be a literal number, and it can't be the same thing as the multitudes that he sees immediately afterwards, well, then we have to ask, well, why is the Lion of Judah and the lamb that has been slain the same thing? Because one is something he hears about, and the next is something he sees. Why aren't those two different images if this is two different images? So yeah, that's a great observation. We don't know the answer. It depends on how you read Revelation.
I have one more.
Absolutely. I love this.
One more observation.
Yeah.
Also images of gold in the city, and I looked back, and in Genesis said that Genesis 2:11, the whole land of Havilah where there is gold.
Yeah.
So the original creation was full of gold, and this, kind of showed me that this earth is going to be returned to the way God had
Absolutely, that's good. Some other things we can draw out of this is even the description, 12,000 stadia. It's a 12 times 1,000. So if 12 is the number of the covenantal people of God and 1,000 is infinite, that is not necessarily a literal mileage description as much as it is showing the infinite vast expanse. Other things about 12,000 is that 12,000 stadia is roughly the width of the Roman Empire. So when John's readers, who are Roman citizens or people under the dominion of Rome, are hearing about God's new kingdom that is the same size as all of the Roman Empire, it is meant to indicate that, or it could be indicating to them, the people who this was originally written to, that God's kingdom is replacing the kingdom of the world, right? Which is what we hear, right? When earlier in Revelation, when it says that when the seventh trumpet sounds, that you will hear the proclamation of the gospel as is revealed through the prophets. And then the seventh trumpet sounds, and the very first thing the angels say is, behold, the kingdom of our world has become the kingdom of our Lord and Savior. That's Revelation 10 and 11, maybe. And so this shows instead the God's kingdom in contrast with Caesar's kingdom. You hear the list of all the different jewels, and each door made of a different... or the foundations of the wall are adorned with every kind of jewel, right? And those jewels roughly parallel the breastplate of the priest. So indicating that like the city is taking on if the city is the temple, the city is also like the priest where it is. And even more so, as we're looking at the New Jerusalem, it is not necessarily a literal place. And you say, Chris, what do you mean? Well, what I'm saying is, Revelation chapter 21, verse 9 says, Then came one of the seven angels who had one of the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues and spoke to me, saying, Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the spirit to a high mountain and showed me the holy city of Jerusalem. The holy city of Jerusalem that we hear described is a symbolic description of the bride of the Lamb. And who is the bride of the Lamb? God's people. The bride of the Lamb is not a location. The bride of the Lamb is not a physical dimensioned city. The bride of the Lamb is God's people. It has always been God's people. Every time we've talked about the bride of God, whether it was in Ezekiel or Song of Solomon or the marriage supper of the Lamb or in Paul's writings, it is always God's people. So even this description of the new heavens or of the New Jerusalem is a description of what it means to be God's people in the new creation. It's not necessarily a literal city. It could be. We don't know. But the primary image that the text tells us is that this is a symbolic way of describing God's people in the new creation. It is the covenantal people of the Old Testament and the covenantal people of the New Testament, the 12 and the 12, that spans the breadth of the world, that is multitudinous, right? That is beyond count, that is the temple, the place, right? Paul says that you, the church, your body, the bride's body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, right? And so the God's temple is there in amongst his people. His people are the high priest who are adorned with the jewels that the priest was. So interesting, right? There's a whole lot of layers we can go into in apocalyptic writing. So many layers of symbolism. All right, let's change gears here. Prose discourse, right? I'll be honest, some of these are the boring parts of the Bible. You know, most of us don't sit down and I'm so glad I got to the censuses today. I really am excited how many tribes from this family, of this clan, of this people in this many tents and how many oxen they had. Right, we're not going to talk about censuses specifically. We're talking about biblical law today, which is also is very few people's favorite part of the Bible. Is anyone here's favorite part of the Bible the law? You love reading about how many turtle doves and oxen and sheep and all that, right? The law is super complicated. So let's start with the first question. Just throw it out there for commentary. What comes to mind when you think about biblical law? What's your gut reaction? First thoughts that pop to mind. The 10 Commandments. Okay, good. Yeah.
What the people had to do in order to...
Right, what the people had to do. Some of us may think irrelevant. That's old stuff I don't need to worry about. That might be how we react to it. Boring might be how we react to it. Confusing, because you read some of it and you're like, why does God require this? Like, why can't I wear linen and cotton? Why was that a bad thing? My polyester blend, was that going to send someone to hell? Was that what it was? Or maybe there are specific laws that stick out and you're like, how could a just God do this? Or we stick to singular laws and dictate lots of views today based on specific Old Testament laws. So the law, right? So the first thing we should understand is when we talk about biblical law, that this term is used very differently. So the Bible often uses the term the law and the prophets, right? So for instance, when the rich man and Lazarus, and Moses says to Lazarus, like, your brothers have the law and the prophets. The law generally in that context, right? Or when Jesus says, like, on this, the greatest commandments are love God and love your neighbor, on this rest all the law and the prophets. The law generally in that context refers to the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And the prophets refer to everything else, the later prophets and the earlier prophets, right? Which is Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 1 Kings, that tell the story and then have the prophetic message behind it. So in the general scope of the Bible, when they talk about the law, it means Genesis through Deuteronomy. However, when we are talking in literature, we mean specifically parts of Exodus, Leviticus, parts of Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the actual legal codes. The do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that, where God lays out the requirements. And the law is almost always intermixed with periods of story. So there's like, God gives some of the law, and then Moses goes down the mountain and he sees the golden calf. So we go from law giving to narrative back to law giving. And then Deuteronomy largely summarizes everything that's already been said in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Deuteronomy is largely a retelling of everything that has just happened. And so you'll hear laws repeated in Deuteronomy, and sometimes you'll hear them repeated in slightly different ways. So there are times when one law is described in Deuteronomy that is described slightly differently or in different terms in Leviticus or in Exodus. There's a lot of theories as to why that is. And it's probably, and the main theory is because they believe Deuteronomy was probably written later. But Deuteronomy became the primary book of the law. And in fact, when it talks about how like Josiah found the book of the law in the temple, many scholars believe that what he found actually was Deuteronomy. Because Deuteronomy is like the single summarized copy of all of it. It gives everything, instead of having to pick through, this is the whole thing from in Deuteronomy. If you follow Deuteronomy, similar to how people say like, of the Gospels, John is the theology of the New Testament. Anyone ever heard something like that before? Like, if you want to read the Gospel that's more theological, read John. Well, Deuteronomy is basically the theology of the Old Testament. It talks about why they got the law, and then everything else that happens is because they didn't follow the law, right? So Ezra, when he finds the book of the law, probably finds Deuteronomy. So now another interesting question is, does biblical law apply to Christians? Yes. Okay. Anyone have a different answer?
All depends.
It all depends. It's complicated, right? That's probably the right answer, is that it's complicated. Sometimes Christians say, well, we're not under the law, and that's right. When we hear Paul talk about not being under the law, that doesn't mean we don't have to follow it. It's that the law is not a prerequisite to being made righteous. We're made righteous through Christ, right? But that does not mean that components of the law are not revelations of God's heart. And so when we look at the law, we start having to go through, well, why do we follow certain things? Most Christians are going to say murder is a sin. Most of us aren't going to say polyester is a sin. Right? You know, a whole lot of people going to hell if polyester was a sin, right? Right? But the Bible says don't mix two different types of fabric. Don't wear cotton and linen at the same time, right? Or linen and wool, I think. And it's in Deuteronomy 20. We'll look at it in a little bit. Or for instance, God says like to Peter, like, don't call unclean that which I have made clean. So most of us don't follow. I like shrimp and bacon. Bacon wrapped shrimp is incredible food, right? That is a no-no in the Old Testament. So on one hand, there are components of the law that do apply still because they are, but there are others that don't. And virtually all of us agree with that. Jesus himself says, love God, love neighbors, love self. That is part of the law. Yes, Karen?
Is that because we're living under grace?
So, yeah, and it's as we're going to look today, there are different types of laws generally found in biblical law, and they serve different functions. Some of them, or many of them, are ritual laws that are about being made clean or unclean, which are related to our ability to participate in temple worship. Becoming unclean didn't mean that you were sinful. It meant that you couldn't go to the temple or the tabernacle. You couldn't participate in ritual worship, which was the ritual worship and the sacrifice was about having our sins atoned for. And so because Christ has atoned for our sins, I don't need to sacrifice. And if I don't need to sacrifice, then it doesn't matter if I'm ritually unclean, because ritual uncleanliness was related to my ability to offer sacrifices. So many of the laws are all related to the sacrifice in the temple, but if Christ is the sacrifice and we don't have to anymore, then there's no longer a need to comply with those other things because I'm not offering any more sacrifices. And we'll get to that in just a second.
Is there still a temple?
There is not a physical temple, no. The Jewish temple does not exist anymore. It was destroyed in 70 AD. The temple is the body of the church. And in fact, and we'll talk about this next week, when Paul tells the Corinthians, don't you know your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, he's not saying you, Ruth, or you, Karen, or you, Chris. He's saying you, y'all's body, you, the Corinthian church, the church's body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. We don't have and the Greek supports that. Most often when you read the word you in the Bible, especially in Paul's letters, it is you plural, it's y'all. So the temple of the Holy Spirit, where God has rested, is on his body, the church of Jesus Christ. So yes, there is a temple, the church, and not this church, not this physical building, but the body of believers where God's presence has come to rest. Because that's what the temple is. It's the place where God's presence has come to rest, and his Spirit has come to rest on his believers. So, fun facts. We'll talk about more of that next week when we get into the epistles. So, a couple of thoughts on the legal writing. Well, so first off, basically all the laws are related to love God, love self, love neighbors. Almost everything falls within one of those categories. And here's some honest feelings. One, they can be long and very boring. The legal passages can be hard to read. Sometimes it's really hard to care. Just why do I care? I don't make sacrifices. Why does it matter? So in the question is, why do Old Testament sacrifice rituals matter to us in a New Testament context? Because they give us glimpses of principles of God's kingdom. They tell us about things that God cares about. They're not necessarily things that we need to follow always, or things that we need to necessarily build society around, but they show us glimpses of God's heart. And they must be read in context. And that's hard because most of us are not scholars on the ancient Near East. I'm not a scholar on the ancient Near East. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But before we get there, question. Why did God give Israel the law? Any thoughts? Why did God give Israel the law?
Well, from living in Egypt for so long under their rule, they had...
That's right. That's absolutely it. They were slaves. They had no self-governance. They didn't know none of them were political philosophers. They didn't know how to run a country, right? They just did what Pharaoh told them to, but Pharaoh's ways were wrong. So what should they do? Well, they needed guidance in how to run a society. So God says, okay, cool. Here's how you can run a society. That's one of the main reasons. Very good. What else? There's,
God's kingdom is his law,
yeah,
and it includes me right now,
Yeah.
present day. Because without the law, I mean, you can't obtain much closeness with God.
yeah. Well, and part of the purpose of the law was to help make sure Israel fully understood that they could not do it on their own,
Right.
that they could not keep the law. Part of the law and the ritual components of the law, it's not so much if you do these things, it's when you become unclean, this is how you fix it, right? When these things happen, here's how you resolve them. Part of the purpose of the law, and Paul writes about this in Galatians, talks about how like the law was like a stumbling block. Like the law was not there to trip people up. The law was to show that they were vastly insufficient on their own and that they needed a savior. Because going back to Genesis, humans thought they could do it on their own. They thought they could get wisdom on their own. And that was the whole story of of humanity, is we think we can do it on our own. And the purpose of the law was a constant reminder that they could not do it on their own. That everything they had was God's. They couldn't get out of Egypt on their own. The beginning of the law, the beginning of the 10 Commandments, right, is like, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. That statement is repeated throughout the law because the law, in part, is a perpetual reminder that Israel was not enough. They could not be enough. They couldn't get themselves out on their own. Yes, Karen?
Was this also supposed to bring the people closer to God, to know him, to love him?
Yeah, so part of it helps shape some of that, like how they can go about doing that, how they can go about knowing God, right? Because one of the things we hear from, like even especially in the New Testament context, that like knowing and loving God was in keeping his commandments. Or like even like last Sunday where I talked about like where God in Jeremiah says like Josiah took up the cause of the poor and the needy. Is that not what it means to know me? That comes directly out of Levitical law. The law, like fun fact, does anyone know what the most common commandment in the Levitical law, or I guess in the Old Testament law is? What commandment is talked about most times?
Love God.
No, it is love the poor, the needy, and the marginalized. Caring for the poor, the widow, the foreigner, the stranger, the marginalized. There's a whole bunch of different variations of that, but that is mentioned more times in the law than the command to love God, any sacrifice command, more than commands about adultery or murder. The most commonly referenced law or commandment in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy is about care for the marginalized. Right? And so it's like, yeah, one of the ways that we express our knowledge of God is in how we live the principles of God. And the many parts of the law express the principles of God.
In doing so, is that supposed to get us closer to God, showing our love for them?
I think that it's kind of like a two-way thing. Like I demonstrate my closeness to God by living out the ways, mission, and character of God. When I do the things God has commanded me to, I reveal the strength of my relationship to God. And when in walking, or as Jesus says, if you love me, you'll obey my commandments. Right? In my obedience, I reveal the love I have for the Father. And in doing that, I am now in a place where God can continue to show me and reveal himself to me in new and deeper ways. Like, and I mean, one of the great examples, almost anyone that goes on missions trips will talk about how, like, in walking out the obedience to the Great Commission, God reveals himself deeper to them in those places. Like, when we are obedient to God, we are fertile soil for God to reveal himself to us. And the same thing applies in biblical law. As they were obedient to God, they had the opportunity to encounter God, and God could then speak through them and to them. Hopefully in good ways, because when they weren't following the law, God sent prophets to tell them, hey, you're doing the wrong thing. So God revealed him to themselves in a very different way, right? Even like Korah's rebellion. Earth swallowed them up. They knew something about God after that happened, but it was as a result of disobedience. So That's okay.
I don't want to make you think I'm God. But when I was a teacher in the classroom, and the children were definitely not disciplined in the beginning, of course, and I had to lay down the law
Mm-hmm.
to my children, or it wouldn't work.
Yep.
And so it's very important to know the limits.
Absolutely. It is important to know the limits. So something that we should also be aware of is that there are almost no instances in the Old Testament after Deuteronomy, right, where we see the law codes referenced to adjudicate crimes. So what I'm saying is, so the law says this is going to happen if this happens. Almost never do we see that actually enforced. Like in specific situations. Like for instance, when David commits adultery, Nathan doesn't come to him and say, by the way, Deuteronomy's law says this about adultery, therefore this is the punishment that is going to come upon you. Right? We don't see that happen. When Absalom rebels against his father, we don't see the Deuteronomic laws called in saying, hey, here is a son who is rebellious and disobedient. We're supposed to take him outside the camp and stone him. Right? Even as we see the laws, they reveal God's heart, but the vast majority of the time that we see them broken, it is mercy that is expressed throughout the story of the Old Testament. Which reveals an even greater depth of God's character. Let's dig into the law code, right? So there's a couple different types of laws within the law code. So we have a dietary law, ritual cleanliness, sacrifice, and relational. These three are all largely related. So we'll start with dietary codes. This is eat this, don't eat that. You can't have the milk of an animal while also eating their young, right? So if you're following Jewish food law, you can't eat a cheeseburger because you can't have cow's milk and beef because that's eating the animal and its milk at the same time. You can't eat shrimp, those sorts of things. You can only eat certain types of things and whether or not it chews its cud, what type of hooves it has. So these are food laws and they don't apply to us, right? Acts 9:10, right? Peter sees the blanket lowered from heaven with all the animals. God says, take, kill, and eat. Peter says, I've never broken the law in that regard. And God says, why do you call unclean that which I have called clean? So, and then the other thing, and largely these are related because of how they interact with each other. When you eat certain things in violation, it's because those animals are unclean, right? And so you become ritually unclean. And so then you have to follow ritual cleanliness laws to become clean again so that you can sacrifice. Something to think about is that in some ways there's the ritual cleanliness component to dietary laws, but the other thing is that in some ways they are like food safety regulations. Because if you think about it, and there's a lot of study on this, the animals that it tells you not to eat are ones that are generally less good for you to eat. Pork is filled with parasites if you don't cook it right. Like you can eat beef that's like very rare. People eat rare steak all the time. You cannot eat raw pork, right? So pork, and the other thing about pigs is that they would eat anything. They're omnivorous. They would eat they'll eat their own poop, right? And they can grow that way. Shrimp are bottom feeders. They live off of other fish excrement, right? Shrimp are delicious, but they're also, most shellfish, actually all shellfish, are incredibly delicious, but they are the vacuums of the ocean. They eat fish poop, right? Carnivorous animals you couldn't eat. And for the most part, we don't eat carnivorous animals. For the most part, carnivorous animals, their meat is less healthy for you, and when you eat it in long term, it is bad for you because they are not eating plants and animals, they're eating other animals, and so you have different parasites in them and things like that that makes them unhealthy. And that's largely, don't eat rotten animals. If you find a dead animal, don't just pick it up and eat it, right? A lot of these laws have an additional layer of helping ensure that they're eating healthy things. Because they've left what is stable homeland and now they're traveling and they're going to encounter animals they haven't seen before. They're going to encounter lots of things. And God's saying, hey, listen, don't do those things. Don't eat that shellfish. It's not as healthy for you, right? And now we obviously have a very different, like we can prepare food differently. We understand things. Like I got my meat thermometer to make sure my pork is like cooked all the way, right? But they didn't have that back then. And you don't want to get like salmonella and stuff like that. So that is, so with that being said, we don't fully know why every animal is included in it. But largely, we can see that, hey, some of these animals, it makes sense. They are less healthy for you. When not prepared the right way, they can be bad for you. And that's something for the people that don't have in-depth knowledge of food regulation or the principles, chemical principles of food or the health of food. It would make sense why those types of things would be off limits. That being said, shrimp's delicious. And God says it's clean, so have your bacon-wrapped shrimp.
My father would like to eat raw meat, basically,
Yeah.
very cooked, and my mother just couldn't understand it, and neither could I.
Yeah.
So she labeled him barbarian.
Yeah. So yeah, most of the dietary codes are related. The consequence of the dietary code is becoming unclean. The animals are unclean, you become unclean, and so then you have to go through ritual cleanliness. And this doesn't mean that people didn't do this. Samson did. He ate the honey out of the lion, and he became out of the dead, rotting lion, and he becomes ritually unclean. Though we don't hear that really brought up in the story of Samson very much, but that's a component of it. So yeah, dietary law. They have health components for many of them, but ultimately God said don't eat these things, and if you do, you become unclean. Which then brings us to this combination of ritual cleanliness laws and sacrifice laws. The ritual cleanliness laws are things like, if you have this condition, you become unclean. Go do this action and you will become clean. But they are related to the tabernacle, right? Because the things that can make you unclean are normal stuff, right? Everybody would become unclean. Even Paul became unclean at some point, right? Because of very normal things. If you trip and cut your leg and you bleed, you're now unclean. Maybe just until the evening, but you're unclean. And you can't go in the temple. You can't participate in ritual sacrifice. So the dietary law and the ritual cleanliness laws are like gatekeeping to what are the requirements to keep people from coming into the temple and participating in the temple unless they are coming as a time to be made clean. And it's a barrier to social interaction because if you're unclean, other people are going to stay away from you lest they become unclean as well. And so yeah, like if you were unclean, you couldn't do things like certain feasts, certain festivals, certain things like that. Stuff you touched became unclean. So, and they're like the one of the underlying reasons for this, there's a health benefit to it. You know, if you're sick, today we understand germs. So if we understand that if I'm sick, I'm going to stay home from church and not go participate in a whole group of people. Well, we would hope so, right? Not everyone does. 2020 showed us a lot of things about sickness and people's opinions about sickness. But like for the most part, we understand like if I'm profusely bleeding, I don't want to go, if I got open wounds on my arm, I don't just walk around, hey guys, what's up? Oh, this is just my arm gash, right? Like you bandage it up, you wait for it to get healthy, and you don't just go like, hey, high five, man. Oh, sorry I cut my hand earlier. Don't worry about it. Like that we generally, because we understand, we have a much deeper understanding of medicine and the body and human anatomy, there's a lot of things that we wouldn't do that they might not understand back then. If you have open wounds and open sores, you were unclean until they got resolved. If you had rashes, you were supposed to go present them to the priest who was going to look at them and say, this is this type of rash or that type of rash. And if it's this type of rash, you're unclean for this many days. If it's that type of rash, you're unclean for this many days. You got to go isolate and keep yourself healthy and get better. And you're not allowed to come back around people until you're healthy again, right? Maybe the church can handle that a little bit more, you know? I've been coughed on one too many times, right?
We have Band-Aids now.
We have Band-Aids now, that's right. But like even just normal stuff, like for instance, when a woman was on her period, she would be unclean for a certain period of time. When a man had, basically when any fluid from inside your body came out of your body, other than like normal using the bathroom, you were unclean. Like, or even I think when you use the bathroom, you were unclean until the time that you like washed your hands. Which, teaching a toddler, hey man, you just wipe, you gotta wash that hands, right? Your hands are unclean right now. They need to be cleansed, right? That's a common thing that we have to teach kids. But like it was in many ways about protecting the community. If there was a dead body, you had to be away. You couldn't touch the dead body, and if you did, you had to stay away for 7 days. Because why'd that body die? They didn't do autopsies. Did it die because it had an infectious disease? Did it die because its liver shut down? Like, we don't know. So whoever touches that body or is around that body, maybe they should just go isolate for a couple days until we figure it out. Like now, largely when people die suddenly, we can very quickly find out why they died. Back then, they didn't. They didn't do autopsies. They didn't understand like, oh, that was cardiac arrest versus that was like a disease that killed it that I might catch. And so these largely were about, there is a component of like social health and welfare, of like doing these things, one, so that we are like trying to emulate like the blemishlessness of the sacrifice, right? God wants things blemishless and spotless that come before him. And so if I've got a gaping chest wound, I don't want to go before God because I'm not like blemishless. But also there is this social health dimension. And in fact, it was observed throughout, it's been observed throughout history. One of medieval Europe was super anti-Semitic. They did not like Jewish people. So Christians in medieval Europe didn't like Jews.
It's still like that.
Well, I mean, it's, yeah, well.
Have you been on the news lately?
There's a lot of places, well, but I mean, Christians in Europe, Christians specifically, God's people didn't like Jewish people in medieval Europe. And they kicked them out of every country they were in. But during the plague, in numerous cities, when the bubonic plague came, the Jewish quarter of that city did not get nearly as sick as the rest of the city. Right? Because they weren't dumping their poop into the street, right? They were practicing ritual cleanliness in ways and ritual washing and stuff like that that the rest of medieval Christians didn't do, or at least didn't do to the same degree. So when someone was sick, they would isolate because that was a requirement under the law. And Christians didn't do that, so people who were sick got around each other and then they spread the plague. And in fact, many Christians blamed the Jews for the plague, and they said that the fact that the Jewish people weren't getting it as much is proof that the Jews caused it. And this is true. Like I'm not making this up. This throughout the 300 years that the plague hit Europe, this happened in numerous cities. It's not an isolated incident. So,
How do you teach children to not spread their colds?
well, that's a good. You tell them not to sneeze in my face, right? That's how you teach it. If I could teach my kids not to sneeze in my face, I would wish I knew how. But I've been coughed on too many times this week.
Tell them to use their hands.
Yep. So anyways, many of these ritual cleanliness laws, just like the dietary laws, they have a health and social welfare component to them. But then they have the second or the other layer, the complementary layer of they are dictating who is allowed to come and do sacrifices, who is allowed to participate in the temple, who is allowed to participate in the religious practice of society. So dietary law, ritual cleanliness laws while some of them have benefits today, right? You know, yeah, if you got an open wound, maybe don't go hug people, right? Like maybe wash your hands, and if you're sick, go isolate for a little bit, right? But being clean and unclean in most of those, whenever you hear about they are unclean or it's clean, it is all about the capacity of the person to go and do sacrifice in the temple. And we don't have sacrifices anymore, and the temple is no longer in existence, or at this point it was the tabernacle. So that is largely why they don't apply to us. Because if there's no sacrifice, then it does there's nothing left for me to be clean or unclean before, right? So because I don't need to go make the sacrifice, because Christ already made the sacrifice, and now we are all the temple, and God's called us clean. So these groups of laws that relate to cleanliness and uncleanliness are tied to the tabernacle. And when the tabernacle and the temple doesn't exist anymore, and when the sacrifice doesn't exist anymore, then their application is dramatically lessened. That doesn't mean they're not good rules. You shouldn't eat rotten animals. Fun fact, right? That's a valuable rule we should still abide by. But it's not going to, like, if you choose to eat rotting animals, that's not like a barrier necessarily to participation in the body of Christ. But that brings us to this last major section of law codes. And that is relational law codes. And these are law codes that relate to how people should, or about how people should relate to each other. How do I, as one person in Israel, interact? What obligations do I owe you as a person in Israel? What do I, as one member of this society, owe you as another member of this society? What are our expectations of behavior? What are, like, these are what are the things that we should or shouldn't do? And these are things like marriage rules. They're talking like what defines how someone can be married? What are the terms of marriage? What are the terms for dissolving marriage? We have a lot of those rules today still, right? That talk about like what is required for marriage. What happens if a marriage dissolves? What are the grounds you're allowed to dissolve marriage? They also talk about similar consequences, but with different preceding effects. So like, is there a difference between an accidental death versus a negligent death versus homicide versus murder? And they don't use those terms, but they exist in there. So for instance, it talks like, if you loan an ox to someone and it kicks them and kills them, well, if you didn't know that this ox was a kicker, then you're fine. You didn't do anything wrong. But if you knew that this ox had a bad temperament and likes to kick people or has kicked people in the past, and you still lent it to them and you didn't tell them that the ox has a bad temperament and they need to watch out, well, now you are negligent and now you have guilt on you, which we do all the time. If I do something knowingly that there's a problem, I am negligent, and negligence plays into whether or not someone is guilty of accidental harm or intentional harm or negligent harm. And negligent harm is different than if I stab someone, right? And so even in our law code today, we have that. And all of these laws and the different types of laws all... and so that's why you have like a law and it might list it like 6 different ways. If this, then this. But if this, then that. But if even third this, then that. And it's stuff like that. If I have an ox and I don't know anything about it and he kills you because you got kicked by an ox, if I didn't know anything about it, how was I supposed to tell you? Like, normal caution should be there. Or for instance, if I lend you my car today and I know that the brakes don't work, and I don't tell you that, and you go smash into someone, well, guess what? I maybe should have told. I was negligent in lending you that car. But if I lend you that car, and I fully expect and believe that the brakes work, and then the brakes stop working, that's very sad, that, and you get injured, it's sad, but like, I did not do wrong to you because I didn't know there was a problem. If I intentionally tamper with the brakes and lend you the car, hoping and expecting you to get into an accident, now I am intentionally harming you, right? Same thing, accident has been caused because I lent you my car. Different conditions dictate the types of law that applies, or the different punishments that go with it. And the law here is largely about making someone whole. If I borrow your ox and it dies, I have to give you a new ox, right? if I take something from you, I have to give it back with interest, right? Or whatever you would have lost by me taking it. So it's about, you were here, let's restore you to where you were, and make you whole. But then some of it also, as we see, there is a huge component of the law that is, we'll come back to that in just a second. However, some of this law reads so badly by modern standards. Some of it sounds abhorrent. And there are many non-Christians or skeptics who read parts of the law and say, how could you worship a God that allows this to happen? Right? And I'll give you an example. Deuteronomy 22. So if a man and a woman sleep with each other, they both, if a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, both the man who slept with her and the woman must die, right? So you commit adultery, you're supposed to, and so let me back that up. Many of the laws are related, and the punishments are commiserate with the effect that it has on society, on the breakdown of society. So the breakdown of the marriage covenant has a huge effect on society, far more than grain prices or something like that. And so things like this, adultery is treated as supposed to be a capital sin in the Old Testament law because of the effect that has on social order. Right? It's not necessarily that like adultery is inherently a worse sin than other sins. It's that the effect of adultery on the breaking down of the social order is disastrous. Right? And if you've ever walked through a divorce with someone and seen how far that ripples out and that break destroys not just an individual family, but like families around them. And it's not a condemnation of anyone who's been through a divorce before. I'm trying to say that like when we look at the second, third, fourth, and fifth order effects, this type of sin or this type of breaking of the law has far greater third, fourth, fifth, and sixth order effects than other types of things. If my scale is off balance and I'm cheating you, that has a different degree of ripple than if I commit murder or do other things. So we have the first set of law, right? If a man sleeps with another man's wife and they're both consenting to this, then they both must die. But now, right, and so this is where you start seeing like, no, that's weird, it's in the law, right? If a man goes to a town and meets a virgin who's pledged to be married, so if she's engaged, you shall take them to the gate and put them to death, right? So if I commit adultery, that is commiserate with if I'm engaged and I commit adultery then, right? Because for us, engagement's not the same as marriage. For them, engagement was functional marriage. It was legally binding. When you became engaged, the spouse, the wife, earned the legal standing, all of the same rights as a wife. She was owed certain things the same way a wife would. So to sleep with someone who's engaged was the same as sleeping with someone's wife. Well, and in this case, it says that if she's in a town, she gets stoned because she didn't scream for help. So if he's raping her and she's in a town where people can hear her and she doesn't scream for help and people don't come and stop it, right, then she gets stoned to death. That's wild. That does not sound like there are people who read that and say, how could you worship this God? Right? But if they're out in the country, right, and there's no one around and he rapes her, she can't scream for help because there's no one there, so only he dies. However, and that's only if she's pledged to be married. That's only if she is legally bound to someone else. If he meets someone who's not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they're discovered, right, he has to pay money to her dad, and then he has to marry her, and he can never divorce her. Punishment for rape is you have to marry your rapist in Deuteronomic law. And it's super hard for us to read this and say, wow, how is that just? And what I'm going to present to you is that when we're reading Levitical law, we cannot read it based on how well would this law jive today, right? Because it's not written for today. If God was giving the law for the first time in the 21st century, he would probably give some of it differently. No, because he's giving the law to an ancient Near Eastern context. And so when we read the law, we need to read the law in comparison to other laws of other countries at this time. How does God's law stand up against all of the other nations? Right? Because the part of the law is God setting himself apart from Egypt or from Babylon or these other countries, showing that he is different than these other nations. And the reality is that the Hebrew law, this law, is very progressive compared to many ancient Near Eastern law. When you compare it to things like the Code of Hammurabi or other Egyptian laws, it is much more just and much more fair than anything. It is, in some ways, it's unheard of. Because, for instance, this law applies to everybody. The punishments are the same whether you're Moses or you're some slave or a foreigner in the land. You have equal punishment. Whereas in many other places, and in theory we have that in America, but let me tell you we don't. Because if O.J. Simpson had a public defender, I don't know if he would have been found not guilty, right? He was rich, he could afford a really good attorney, therefore there's probably a different outcome than if he had had a public defender because he was poor. We definitely, so we say that everyone has equal access before the law in America, but if you're poor, you're probably less likely to have a favorable outcome because you can't afford a good attorney.
Good example.
And I'll stand by that, right? My wife's an attorney. Let me tell you, not all situations are made equal. But in this case, in this law, because in many other countries, your social status dictated, or your rank dictated the type of punishment. The punishment for a king was not existing. Kings weren't held accountable to the law. They were the king. They could do whatever they wanted. A king could rape whoever he wanted, right? Across the ancient Near East. But here it says, no, everyone applies by these laws. If you were like a lord or a noble, a different set of punishments applied than if you were a slave in some of these other countries. But here, God's law says, no, the law applies equally to everyone. Everybody abides. So that's hugely progressive. In fact, the other thing is that in many cases, the punishments are far less severe. For as severe as these sound, when you compare Hebrew law to many other laws out there, far fewer of them are capital punishment laws. There's only a handful of things that are going to get you executed in Israel. Whereas execution was far more common outside of this. Additionally, you also, the Hebrew law calls for mutilation far less, right? In many other ancient Near Eastern countries at this time, you commit certain crimes, you're going to have your arm chopped off. You'll have your eye gouged out. There are mutilating, permanent disfigurement of your body that's going to happen, or you will be beaten far more often than in Hebrew law. So already this law, for as difficult as it is to understand why this is just by our standards, right? They didn't have nuanced concepts of consent then. But this law applies more equally than any other law at this time. It is far less severe than almost any other law at this time. And it applies to both foreigners and citizens. And there are specific laws you could go through if you want. There's a book, it's called The Bible and Social Justice. It's a great book. It's a good read. It's a scholarly read, but it's a good read. And the first chapter the whole first chapter talks about Hebrew law code in relation to other ancient Eastern law codes and gives examples. Like, this is where the Code of Hammurabi says this, and this is where the equivalent is for for Hebrews, right? Showing how for Israel, who has only ever known Egyptian law, and for Israel, who is going to encounter all of these other nations, right? Their law is going to be what sets them apart from the other nations. And their law is reflective of God's heart. God is a merciful God. God is a just God. God sees ultimately what we would say, like everything's level at the foot of the cross, right? And the same way here, the law is meant to equally apply to everyone. Yes, we'll start with Karen and then Karen. Yeah.
I just thank God that our laws were based on biblical principles. Because if we hear about what happens in other countries, it's pretty wild.
Well, yeah, and so and some of our laws certainly are based on biblical principles. Others, maybe not so. But yeah, no, you're right. That we have, on one hand, we have some very favorable laws to protect people. On the other hand, the U.S. has more people incarcerated than almost any other country, and we execute more people than almost any other country. Yeah. Well, yeah, but even built into that, all of our law code is tied to that. But yeah, you're right. Yeah, Karen.
I was just thinking of, the law is harsh, but it's meant to be a deterrence as well.
Yeah, it is meant to be a deterrence. Yeah.
Don't sleep with anybody but your own wife.
Yeah. Don't do things that break down society. Absolutely. But if you do, it's also meant to protect people. So, for instance, in that case where that husband, where that guy, we just saw the guy, if he rapes someone who's not betrothed to be married, he has to pay the dad and marry her, and then can never divorce her, which means that she has legal protection for her entire life. So even in that law where we'd say, why shouldn't he be punished harsher? Well, because in that society, she wasn't going to be able to get a different husband. She had been defiled. And so her dad receives the bride price that he is owed, and then that woman now has a husband to provide for her whole life. If they executed that guy, who was going to take care of her? If she's pregnant, who's going to take care of her kids? In our world today, people who have been married before, who have kids, that is super common for them to get married again. They can work on their own. In our world today, that is that's not a problem. Oh, there's this single mom. Okay, that happens all the time. We can say whether or not that's a problem, but it's an obstacle that we have accepted it can be overcome in our society. And if someone were to say, well, I don't want to marry that person because they got raped, that person would be crucified, would say, what a heartless person. How is that something that's going to devalue them before you? Right? We would, in our modern day society, that is not something that we would accept as a reasonable reason. Oh, I love this person, but I found out they were raped when they were younger, and I don't know if I want to marry someone who's been raped. Right? That's not something we would say, or we would accept people to say. We'd say, wow, that's super unloving and super uncharitable. And then where's grace? And how does that define that person? And I'm not trying to pass a value judgment on that. I'm trying to say that back then, if you've been raped and you were a virgin, no one was going to marry you. And now this guy has to. And he can never divorce you. So he can't marry you and then divorce you later on. You will be provided for life. It might not be the best life you've ever had, right? But you will have some semblance of legal protection your whole life. Yes?
I was thinking about Moses' sons.
Mm-hmm.
Went out to kill that guy that raped their sister.
Yeah, so that'd be Jacob's sons, right? So Jacob's sons, they went out the rape of Dinah, I want to say. Yeah, and they killed the guy who was from a different country. Yeah. So anyways, our law code, the biblical law code, we can't look at as it compares to U.S. law today, or what would be reasonably accepted as law today. We have to compare it to how does this law stand up against other ancient Near Eastern law? And when we understand that, what does that tell us about God? What does the fact that God has the law apply to everyone tell us about God? What does the fact that God doesn't execute as many people tell us about God? What are those principles? The other huge component to ancient Near Eastern law, or to Hebrew law, that is absolutely unheard of in other ancient Near Eastern law is the care for the poor. As I said, that is the number one commandment talked about in the Bible. Well, let me phrase that, in the law.
The character of what?
What did it tell us about the care? The care for the marginalized, for the poor. And so that's the poor, the widow, the orphan, the sojourner, the foreigner. Those are all different terms used at different places. But that law is mentioned more times than anything else. It talks about that you're not to deny them justice. You're allowed to, you need to let them stay with you. When you're gleaning your fields, you're supposed to leave stuff for them, right? It's not about, I got to pick 100% of it, right? It's, I've already gone through. The rest of it is theirs, is for other people. There are huge components because that is absolutely unheard of. So not only is God's law more universally applied, not only does God's law in the Old Testament have much more lenient punishments, it also builds into the society of Israel a care for the least of these. Right? It was not I grew this wheat, I'm going to harvest every last bit of it, and if I don't get it all the first time, I'm going to go back and get the rest, and if someone else wants it, well, they can go buy it. And if they don't have money, they can just go work harder to get some wheat. It was, I did my first harvest. Whatever's left, someone else can have. Because it was never mine, it was always God's. It was a perpetual reminder that they own nothing, everything they have is God's. Remember, the number one part of the law, where I am the Lord your God who drew you out of Israel. It is the reminder that they cannot do it on their own. They did not earn it on their own. They have none of it is theirs. It is all God's. And part of that society, and in some way, many ways, our economic system is not built that way. Because this wasn't charity. It wasn't, I've harvested everything and now I'm going to give it away. It was, this is all God's and I'm going to leave some of it for them. Because whatever gets left behind is theirs. I've taken my due. They get theirs. It's not charity the way we build charity. And it's very anti-capitalistic in that regard. The goal is not make as much wheat as you can, grow as much wheat. It's that, or harvest everything and maximize profit. It's deal justly with people. Apply the same standards. Whatever is left is for other people, not for you. From the book, The Bible and Social Justice, it says that the covenantal code, right, the biblical law, functioned to motivate ancient Israelites to implement the justice that these laws represent. That is, that the biblical law functions to develop the conscience of the community. This is, how do we love our neighbor? This is how we do it. By not breaking down society, by actively caring for the marginalized and the poor. And in fact, Jesus reiterates many of these principles, and we talked about it last Sunday. Care for the foreigner is unique to biblical law and is not included in any other ancient Near Eastern law. And it is mentioned more times than laws about Sabbath, about loving God, or even about circumcision. More than the laws about worshiping God, God says, this is how you worship me, by upholding these societal standards and functions. So, right, main three, dietary, ritual, and sacrifice. The dietary and ritual have health benefits. They have things that help keep a society safe, but largely they are about ritual cleanliness, which impacts the ability to participate in religious festival and sacrifice. For the vast majority of those, they don't apply to us because if I ate pork today, I can still come to church, right? That doesn't mean that if you're sick, you shouldn't maybe stay home, especially in the world of live streaming. That's largely what they mean. The relational law codes are about how do we function as a people. And they are complicated. They don't always make sense. And when we read them, if we're like, wow, that's a weird law, then we need to pause and ask ourselves, well, why? How does this stand up to other laws? What does this maybe reveal about God? And it's so interesting. You dig up really random things. I remember I was writing a paper one time about, I don't know why I was writing about this, but I was. And it was specifically about the law codes regarding menstruation, which is like, not the thing that a 26-year-old is writing at their kitchen table, but that's what I was doing. And it's really interesting. And I think something that I felt was revealed to me that is maybe not the primary intent, but certainly a part of it, right? So when a woman would become unclean when she began to menstruate, and then after her last day of menstruation, she could not have intercourse with her husband for a week. So when you look at average ovulation cycles and menstruation times, day 12 or 13 after the beginning of menstruation is the first day she can have intercourse with her husband. So after almost 2 weeks, a husband can have sex with his wife when she is ovulating, which means that is the highest likelihood she's going to get pregnant. Like, part of this designing of the law, in part, is to help perpetuate the growth of Israel. Because hey, you got to have a drought of no relationship with your spouse, but when you can, you're going to get pregnant, right? And so then you have a whole bunch of babies. And then you grow as a people. And it's like, that's not necessarily the primary intention of that law, but it's something that, like, and I sat down and did way more research than I ever thought I would on ovulation cycles and menstruation cycles. But I was asking why? What is so important about this week? Why? Why do we need this week? And then what does that tell us about childbirth? And it's just oh my goodness. Part of this law is designed, divinely ordered by God to help his people grow and become numerous. But that's something that you're just reading it and you're well, that's weird. And you don't think about it if you just blow past it. And I sat there and studied it a whole bunch, and it's really, really interesting. Anyways, biblical law. Oh, we're supposed to watch a video, yeah. And then we'll wrap up.
Reading the Bible from the beginning, you'll get about halfway through the second book, Exodus, and you'll come to a bunch of ancient laws.
Thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that.
Now these laws are all written in the literary style we call prose discourse. And they're found all over the second, third, fourth, and fifth books of the Bible. There's over 600 laws.
And since reading ancient law code isn't something you and your friends do a lot, odds are you're going to struggle. So, let's talk about how to read the law in the Bible.
So the first thing to remember is that the Bible is not a behavior manual with a complete list of what to do and not to do to make God happy.
Right, the Bible is an epic narrative. But in the story, God does tell people what to do.
For sure. The story begins with God's plan to rule the world through humans who will trust him and live by his wisdom. And here we find the first divine command in the Bible.
Don't eat from the tree of knowing good and evil, because the day you do, you'll die.
But the humans take the authority to know and define good and evil for themselves, and it's not good. It leads to a world of violence and death, and they're exiled from the garden.
Okay, so this was the first law in the Bible?
Well, it's the first divine command, and it invites people to trust God and live by his wisdom. And so while it's not part of the laws given to Israel, it does foreshadow them, because those too are invitations to trust God's wisdom.
So when do the laws of Israel come?
Okay, here's the story. Israel is enslaved in Egypt, so God saves them and then invites them into a covenant relationship, like a marriage. And the laws make up the terms of that covenant.
And so do we get a catalog of all these laws that God gave Israel?
Actually, no, we don't get all of the laws, only examples. And these have been strategically placed in between stories about how Israel keeps violating the laws.
So I'm supposed to see that Israel's no different than the humans in the garden. They don't trust God or live by his wisdom.
Right, and so it leads to another round of tragedy, violence, and death.
And it ends in exile.
And so while the laws are good and show God's wisdom, they also expose Israel's inability to be God's faithful partners.
I'm following. But when I read the laws, I find a lot of strange stuff. Like not allowing clothing to be made of 2 different fabrics. How does that show God's wisdom?
Okay, so it's important to realize that many of these laws are ancient ritual symbols that set Israel apart, that is, made them holy. So some laws made Israel distinct from neighboring nations, while other laws kept them away from things that in their culture symbolized death, disease, and moral corruption.
Okay, but what about all of the ritual killing?
Sacrifices were also ritual symbols that connected people to God. Since you, a mortal, can't ascend up to God's presence in the heavenly temple, a blameless animal that was offered could go up in your place, covering for your failures, so you can know you're accepted by God.
I see. But not all of the laws are ancient rituals. Some of them are just about being a good person, treating others well.
Well, yes, but these laws aren't just about being good. They're about justice, which is a big deal to God. On the first page of the Bible, we learn that every human is made in God's image and is worthy of dignity. And these laws apply that ideal in Israel's day. In fact, these laws still underlie many of the concepts of justice and equality that we take for granted today.
But some of the laws don't seem just, like laws that allow for slavery.
Well, if you look at those laws in their ancient cultural context, you'll see that God's working with Israel as he finds them, pushing them towards justice. So slavery isn't abolished, but it is undermined. For example, Israel was supposed to reenact the Exodus celebration by releasing slaves and forgiving all debts every 7 years. This was revolutionary in the ancient world.
All right. Now, what about all the laws about Sabbath rest on the 7th day and all the 7-day feasts? I mean, what's up with all of these sets?
Yeah, so these laws about sacred time are all connected to the first creation narrative in Genesis. God brings order out of chaos in 6 days that each have a clear beginning and end. But when you get to the seventh day, it has no end. That's because it's pointing to the idea of humans partnering with God in his rule and rest. All of these 7-day feasts are rituals that symbolize humanity's true purpose and future.
Okay, so all of these laws given to Israel can fit into those basic categories.
Yes, and each category expresses a core ideal of God's wisdom, and the laws show how those ideals should be applied in the culture of ancient Israel.
But as the story makes clear, Israel failed at fulfilling the law over and over. How is God going to get humans to trust his wisdom?
Well, Moses and the prophets after him trusted that one day God would transform the human heart, so people can be faithful covenant partners who trust his wisdom. That brings us to the story of Jesus.
Yeah, Jesus said he came to fulfill the law.
Right, he was the faithful covenant partner that Israel and all humanity was made to be, but has failed to be. Jesus lived by the divine ideals underlying the laws, and he taught that the laws are all fulfilled when you love God and love your neighbor as yourself.
And Jesus promised that God's Spirit would come and transform his followers so they too could live this way.
And so, when followers of Jesus read these laws today, we need to remember they were given to Israel in their ancient cultural setting. You couldn't follow many of them even if you tried.
But what you can do is see God's wisdom in the laws.
Right, and trust that God's Spirit can guide you to follow that wisdom as you learn to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself.
All right. Well, this week, our reading exercise, there is roughly one chapter worth of Deuteronomy. It's split between two, Deuteronomy 23 through Deuteronomy 24, and it's on your paper. Just read it. Generally, which category do these laws fall under? How do these laws interact with the greater story of Israel? So, for instance, do any of these laws, do you see them played out somewhere in the story, in the rest of the Bible? What are major themes from these laws, and what might those themes tell us about God? And then how might we apply those themes to our world today? So, next week will be our final week together, and then we will study epistles, Paul's writings, and then we'll give some concluding thoughts too. Comments, questions, concerns? All right. And then, so next week will be our last week. I know for many of you, you're already aware, Judy Price will be starting a community Bible study second week of September during this time window. So you're also welcome to join us after that for that. But